He was stalking 2,400 women that we know.
Nobody was safe from him. There were no bounds. He was throughout the whole state of Ohio.
A sexual predator whose dangerous obsession would lead to rape and torture.
He was very meticulous at his crime scene. It wasn't like a crime of passion, and he was real sloppy and left a lot of evidence.
He doesn't fit the criminal profile at all. He's the father, the husband, the civil servant. He's the kind of guy that you look up to.
He's the boogeyman.
Who was this man, and why was he stalking the women of Cleveland? In September of 1999, Brian Kilroy decides to spend Labor Day weekend with his mother at her apartment in Lakewood, Ohio. Sunday night, he is sleeping on the couch when an intruder breaks into the house.
Oh, shit, I was terrified. I was woken up out of my sleep. There's a man holding a knife in my back. He looked like a prowler, you know. He'd come in there, sweatshirt and a black stocking pulled over his face.
He yelled at me, put your hands behind your back, put your hands behind your back. And I grabbed onto his wrist, rolled him off the couch, smashed the coffee table, just drilling him. He stabbed me in the arm once there.
I found the butt of the broken glass while we were fighting. I was grinding that in the back of his head for a while. I guess it put him to bleeding pretty bad.
What amazed me was on this brown carpet, pools of blood.
When Carol Ann Danielchek-Senka, the Kilroy's upstairs neighbor, hears Brian calling for help, she comes downstairs.
I saw him sitting on a man dressed in black. Brian had his arms outstretched and he was pinning him to the floor. Brian knew he was in a fight for his life. Brian kept saying, call the police, so I dialed 911 real quick.
911. Send someone right away to 2116 Warren Road. We have trouble here, please. What's going on? Please come. There's someone in the house trying to kill somebody, please. Is there weapons there? Gun in his hand. A knife in his hand.
Brian kept saying, he's got a knife, get the knife.
She's like, how? I hand her the vase, and it's like, you know, beat his hand until he drops the knife. So she started doing that.
He finally let go of it, and I hit it with the bottle, and it shot clear across the room. And that's when he started to whimper. Let me go, man, let me go, man. Come on, man, let me go.
Fat chance of that happened at this point, you know. Then the police walked in when they pulled the mask off his face. He still couldn't recognize him. I mean, he was bleeding so bad. And inside the mask, I mean, his whole head was saturated with blood.
He asked me if I knew who he was, and I looked at him and said I didn't think his mother would recognize him because he was a mess.
The intruder isn't carrying any identification and refuses to answer any questions. So who is this man in black? And why, the police want to know, did he attack Brian Kilroy?
And they're running down the list about, you know, who have you pissed off? Who did, you know, why would somebody come in here and try to kill you? And it's like, well, it's just, I'm trying to think. It's like, I really don't think anybody at the time, you know, you never know. But who would know when I was there? Because I didn't tell nobody I was going home to Mom's.
With no answers, the police take Kilroy and his attacker to the hospital. Brian Kilroy is treated and released. His attacker is taken into custody. Meanwhile, police search the neighborhood looking for clues to the attacker's identity. While checking the registrations of cars parked in the area, police come across a minivan parked a block away from the Kilroy apartment. In the van is a driver's license matching the intruder. His name is Thomas McCarthy. Also in the van are a badge and ID card identifying McCarthy as a Cleveland firefighter. But why would a firefighter break into the house of a stranger? Detective Jim Sacco of the Lakewood Police Department is the primary investigator.
I mean, it wasn't over a girl. It wasn't fighting over, you know, a dispute over money or property or something. That this was pretty involved, pretty thought out, premeditated, and we didn't know why.
As police search the van, they make a puzzling discovery.
We found these papers, pieces of cups, pieces of napkins with what appeared to be license plates, and there was a legal pad with women's names on it and what appeared to be a coding system as to a rating kind of thing. You know, and at this point, we're not sure exactly what this all means, but there's tons of this stuff, and it's all over. It's in garbage bags, it's in napkins, it's on scraps of paper, it's on pieces of mail, it's on a side of a styrofoam cup, all these names and numbers or vehicle with a license plate, that kind of thing.
When Sacco contacts the Cleveland Fire Department, he learns that McCarthy, an 18-year veteran, is well respected by his colleagues.
He was just a good person and a good fireman.
Police also learn that McCarthy is 43, married, the father of 2 children, and on the side he owns an aquarium cleaning business. But early on in the inquiry, police also get their first clue that the career firefighter dedicated to helping others has a dark side. 12 years earlier, in 1987, McCarthy had been following 2 women home from a bar when he tried to run their car off the road.
At this point, we're realizing that, coming to realize is that this is probably not the first time he's done this.
Lakewood police decide to search McCarthy's locker at the firehouse.
Searching those, we find articles from newspapers dealing with women, locations, addresses, sort of somewhat of the same nature of coding them.
Armed with another warrant, police search McCarthy's home and find more women's names and license plate numbers on a computer disk.
We're pretty much thinking, hey, this guy looks like he's stalking these women, or he's doing something, because there's just such a volume of information about women that would not be anything related to an aquarium business or the fire department or anything else that would be a legitimate purpose.
McCarthy is still not talking, but when police interview Brian's sister Peggy, who lives in the apartment with her mother, she tells them about a frightening experience that she had a week earlier in a grocery store.
Every aisle that I'd go down, I'd see him. And then I was already on the other side of the store, and he was there again. So I thought, okay, I grabbed everything I needed, and I went up to the checkout counter, and I didn't see him then. And then I was in my car, and I'm heading home, and I looked in my rearview mirror, and I saw him behind me. And when the light turned green, he went straight, and I turned into my side street. I knew exactly who it was when my brother said that there was somebody in the house.
She felt this fellow was following her, that she recalled that he had a fire shirt on, with a logo on it, which at the time we were speaking with her, that information was not made known to her.
With Peggy Kilroy, police now have a link between McCarthy and the attack on Brian Kilroy.
When we realized what's going on, we put out a teletype advising that we have this male in custody, appears to be a stalker, and if anybody had information regarding a similar crime, that they should contact us.
When we return, the names on McCarthy's list trigger a massive police investigation leading to new victims. Detective James Clift and Sergeant Glenn Blatnicka from the Middleburg Heights, Ohio Police Department are investigating an unsolved rape when they see the teletype from the nearby Lakewood Police Department about the arrest of firefighter Thomas McCarthy. They immediately notice the similarity between the way the rapist in their case was dressed and the way McCarthy was dressed when he broke into the Kilroy home.
It was obvious to us when he was caught in Lakewood that this was going to be our guy. He had a stocking over his face, he was wearing the rubber gloves, he had a knife in his pocket.
The rapist left no clues to his identity. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, and he didn't leave any physical evidence at the crime scene. But there were indications that he had carefully thought out what he was going to do.
It would just be indicative of somebody that had planned it. It wasn't like something just spur of the moment type of thing, where he would have left, little things unturned, or left something behind that could have been a key piece of evidence at that time. Obviously, he, knew what to take out of there.
He also planned what he wanted to do to the victim. For nearly 3 hours, he held her captive in her house, tied her to a pole in her basement, sexually assaulted and tortured her with a stun gun.
He's one of the more sadistic people that I've come across, at what he did to her as a victim.
Following the rape, the Middleburg Heights police received a call that a blue minivan, similar to McCarthy's, had been seen repeatedly driving past the homes of both the rape victim and her parents. At that time, McCarthy was brought in for questioning.
We had nothing to tie him to our victim. He denied knowing our victim. He denied being on her street. He denied being on her mother's street. He did match the general physical description of the assailant.
But with no conclusive evidence to link him to the rape and torture, McCarthy was released. One of the few things that police learned during the course of their investigation is that several months before the Middleburg Heights rape, a house guest of the victim saw a man on the front porch taking mail out of the mailbox. Knowing that Lakewood police had found mail in McCarthy's home, the Middleburg Heights police conduct their own search of McCarthy's house, looking for something to connect him to the rape.
I mean, there was just piles and piles and piles of stuff everywhere in that house. And we tried to go through every piece of paper we could, and every piece of clothing we could.
The search continues until help comes from an unexpected source, McCarthy's wife.
We'd asked her if there was anything in the house that may help us and save some time. She went downstairs along with us, and she showed us a pile of letters and mail, and in that stack was a couple magazines with our victim's name on it.
That's the smoking gun that we needed to link McCarthy to our rape.
The police have caught McCarthy at the Kilroy apartment and now link him to a rape. But McCarthy still isn't talking. And so the question remains, what about the names, license plate numbers, and mail that police found?
Never in my experience in 23 years in law enforcement have I seen anything of this magnitude as far as one individual maintaining and compiling all this information on so many other people for criminal intent.
Believing there might be other victims, Cuyahoga County Prosecuting Attorney William Mason organizes a task force to investigate the more than 2,000 names found on the scraps of paper that McCarthy collected.
So I took my staff, and we were putting them around the clock to try to track who these people were.
Prosecutor William Mason's office.
It took about 3 weeks to get all that information.
You're calling on the list?
Then I summoned every single police agency throughout the Midwest who had an address that attached to one of those license numbers or names or whatever.
What police know so far is that they are dealing with a serial stalker who has methodically hunted thousands of women and brutally raped and tortured at least one. Mason briefs 130 police agencies from around the region.
Brought them here to the Justice Center, told them what we had, and asked them to go back to their districts and try to look for any old cases or any crimes that would fit this pattern. And then also to go make contact with these victims to find out if they've been maybe followed, if they've been chased, if they know who this guy is.
Most of the females involved were adults, from 20s to 40s, to 50s. Many of the women had no knowledge that he was doing this. And they were homemakers, they were business people, they were clerks. I mean, he didn't seem to have a particular characteristics that he chose.
Quite frankly, it terrified some of them just to think that this person of this sadistic nature was out there stalking them.
Nobody was safe from him. There were no bounds. He was throughout the whole state of Ohio.
From the investigation, a portrait of McCarthy's double life begins to emerge.
He had appeared on one side of his life to be just the perfect husband, father, firefighter, community civic servant. But he had a scary and dark side that he hid from everybody who knew him.
Tom Bradshaw had been his friend for 30 years.
I first met him in high school. We went to a Catholic high school together, the 9th grade. We were both about 14 years old.
On the weekend of the arrest, they were supposed to get together for a Labor Day picnic with some other high school friends, but McCarthy never showed.
The next day, there was a small article in the newspaper that said that he'd been arrested for breaking into a home. I read it and I thought it was a mistake. I kind of thought that I would read about him trying to save someone's life. I never, in my wildest dreams thought it would be for anything criminal whatsoever.
When we found out, it hit us below the belt, but it didn't have anything to do with him being a fireman or even a family man. He was a good family man, we're still recovering.
He was kind of shy, if anything. He was well liked. Everybody trusted him. Thought he was a nice guy. Was very normal. No neglect, no abuse in his childhood, no trauma of any kind. His parents were ideal parents, wonderful parents.
McCarthy is the oldest of 7 children. Like his father and 3 of his brothers, he became a firefighter, joining the department when he was in his mid-20s.
That was all that Tom was interested in being in high school. He had no interest in going to college or anything like that. He just wanted to be a Cleveland firefighter. like his father.
After high school, Bradshaw and McCarthy remained close friends.
We were in each other's wedding, and he was my best man. And as time went on, we didn't see each other as often, but we'd go out once in a while. You know, he would never leave early to follow someone home, leave the bar early, or stay after we left to follow someone, or say anything that was, you know, unusual or out of line or improper that, you know, ever made us think anything.
After the arrest, Bradshaw went to see McCarthy in jail.
I asked him if he'd ever thought about getting caught, if he expected to end up in jail. And he said, no, I never thought about getting caught. He said, I was too careful, I was too smart, they weren't going to catch me.
But they did. When we return, investigators discover how and why McCarthy became a serial stalker.
What I wanted to do was scare him and torture him, cause him physical pain.
McCarthy is the nation's most notorious stalker. I don't know that anywhere in this country that we've been able to document anybody who stalked 2,400 women over such a time frame.
He's your most dangerous criminal because he doesn't look the part, doesn't act the part, has the wife, family in the suburbs, people in the neighborhood feel he's respectable, has an honorable job, that kind of thing.
When a woman's trying to figure out who her stalker is, she's thinking about the creeps and the weirdos and the strange guys, and the nice guys, the Tom McCarthys of the world, are overlooked.
Women are 4 times more likely to be stalked than men. In the United States, 1 woman in 12 is stalked in the course of her lifetime.
Dr. Philip Resnick, a professor of psychiatry at Case Western Reserve University, is an expert on stalking.
Telephone harassment, letters, following, loitering, any type of behavior which is a pattern for the purpose of causing distress is legally defined as stalking.
According to a study in the American Journal of Psychiatry, about 4% of stalkers are sexual predator stalkers, a small but dangerous minority that would include Thomas McCarthy.
Mr. McCarthy would be a classic example of a sexual predator stalker where he stalked his victims unbeknown to them, and his goal was sexual assault. So he's not primarily a stalker, he's primarily a rapist who had a very wide venue of selecting victims for the purpose of raping them.
Authorities are now ready to charge McCarthy with rape, kidnapping, assault, robbery, and stalking.
He knew the evidence that we had, and I think he also knew that we were on him, and we were on everything he's ever done, and that it was a matter of time before we were going to discover more things.
Given the strength of the case against him, McCarthy makes a deal. In exchange for his confession, he will serve a 30-year prison term.
In my opinion, he thought, well, there maybe at least I have the possibility of being released from prison one day, and that's why he pled. And when we started talking about along those lines, I said, I'd be willing to do that if you tell me about all of your crime. Tell me about all the women you've stalked. Tell me about all the things that you've done. And he agreed to do that, and we sat down and he gave a 2-day interview over his activities for the past 10 years.
In June of 2000, as part of his deal, the predator who stalked thousands of women takes the prosecuting attorney's office on an odyssey of stalking, torture, and rape as he recounts his crimes.
So what I wanted to do was scare him and torture him, cause him physical pain.
He was very forthright. You could see that when we asked him a question, he was honest about it. He wasn't nervous, he wasn't shaken.
I think there was relief that his secret life had ended. He didn't need to, you know, cover it up anymore. He told me that, you know, he'd had these fantasies and these compulsions going back to grade school. And, you know, he knew he couldn't talk about it, couldn't discuss it with anyone.
He told us that at a young age he had entered a neighbor's home where a woman was home alone, and he had put a nylon or a ski mask over his head and dishwashing gloves on his hands. And when he entered the home, the woman was asleep on the couch, got awoken, screamed, and he ran out, and they ran towards his house. And his mother questioned him about it then, and he denied it, and that's where it ended.
McCarthy tells investigators his urges to act out violent sexual fantasies grew stronger until he could no longer resist. One night in 1987, when his wife was out of town, he followed 2 women as they were leaving a bar.
But my intention was to follow them to their residence and, if not break in and rape one or both, at that time at least, find where they live and do it at a later date.
When the women realized they were being followed, they tried to lose him, and the chase caught the attention of a police cruiser. McCarthy was arrested and charged with reckless operation of a vehicle, a misdemeanor. According to his statement, after the incident, McCarthy decided to get help at the urging of his attorney.
I was under therapy for 7 or 8 years and wanted to try and figure out where these urges were coming from and overcome them if I could.
It was at this time that McCarthy started to keep lists of all the attractive women he saw.
In the back of my mind, I guess it's kind of like an alcoholic. You want to quit, but you also want to figure out how to still keep drinking. And I wanted to try to figure out how I could still engage in this fantasy. I started following women and keeping track of the information I came across, like their addresses or any information I could find. If I'd see someone in the store, grocery store, I might follow them to the checkout line and get in line behind them and hope that they paid with a check. Look over their shoulder and jot information down and just memorize it.
Because of his odd hours as a fireman, McCarthy was able to stalk women at all hours of the day and night. He even used his part-time job cleaning aquariums as the perfect cover to find new victims. One of McCarthy's clients was a pediatrician.
And I went in and serviced the aquarium after hours. While I had access to the office, I'd look through his files. I'd also go there during the day to check on things, maybe feed the fish or whatever, and if I saw an attractive woman or mother in the waiting room, I'd try and get her name. Next time I was back in the office, I'd look through the records and get her address, phone number, social security number.
He even developed a rating system to categorize the women he stalked.
Instead of a 1 to 10, it was a 1 to 5. That's what the number is, 3.5. A 5 would be outstanding, 4 is pretty good, 3, 2 is so-so. And then the description of whether they were tall or not and color of their hair.
U was for brunettes, E was for redheads, and O for blondes.
And he even put notes on the side of his categorization as if the person had, if she had a dog at her house, if she lived alone. I mean, just kind of informational things that he would go back and stalk with.
By the early 1990s, the names he had gathered numbered into the thousands, and it was then he decided to make a database of his victims.
And I was going to organize it and alphabetize it, make it a little more easy. So the next time I'm over in this part of town, I could look and see if there's any women that happen to be in this neighborhood that I could look in their windows or get more information.
But looking wasn't enough anymore, and McCarthy was struggling to control his violent urges. In 1992, in an effort to help him understand and control them, his therapist had him write down his sexual fantasies.
Fantasy plays a very major role in sexual crimes. Every person has their own favorite fantasy. And that fantasy, I'm sure those things he wrote out to the therapist would be mirrored in what he did. I would not expect a major change.
One of McCarthy's fantasies focused on stalking a woman he called Kelly.
Now Kelly, the one I'm following, is a knockout, a 10. Great body, great face, a Playboy model type. The kind of girl guys drool over. I've been watching her for months now. I followed her to and from work. I know which route she takes and what time she travels. She really doesn't quite understand how much trouble she's in. She's not afraid enough yet. She should be pleading. Soon she will be. In my hand is a fully charged stun gun.
That fantasy, for whatever their psychological needs are, is likely to be a core fantasy. There may be variations of it, but that core fantasy is likely to persist.
Candace Risen, the therapist who treated McCarthy, declined Court TV's request for an interview. But in a prior interview, she said this about sex offenders.
The script gets more elaborated over time, and if they're successful with it, after a while it gets a little boring, so they have to spice it up.
For McCarthy, the script progressed to a detailed account of rape and torture.
I bring the knife up to her throat and lightly touch it. She's holding her breath now, straining, trying to avoid it. This game has endless possibilities, doesn't it, I ask. She sobs a bit, but doesn't respond. She fights to keep her cries from escaping. She's losing that fight.
But writing out his fantasies did nothing to curb his violent urges. By the mid-1990s, McCarthy, who was not considered a sex offender, voluntarily received injections of Depo-Provera, a drug used on sex offenders to decrease sexual drive. But the injections failed to control his desires.
I didn't notice any change in my urges or anything, so we just quit doing it. It wasn't doing good.
It was at this point that his stalking behavior escalated.
When you learned the address of one of the females that you had a fantasy about, did you go to their house?
Usually.
Okay, what did you do when you went to the house?
Well, I would go at night and look in windows. Oh, I'd drive by during the day too and try, you know.
Did you ever take their mail?
Yes. Stole their garbage a few times. Just to try and get as much information about them as I could.
He would go to any means to learn the identity and address of the individual that he thought was a beautiful woman.
Out of the thousands of women he stalked, he became obsessed with a core group of around 20.
He is like no other criminal I ever met with regard to what he was doing. He was very cunning and shrewd.
Sometimes he would break into women's homes and stand in their kitchens, looking at their list of chores or go through their purses.
I got a cell phone bill for somebody. You know, I know I got their cell phone number, got their phone number, you know, that sort of thing. Credit card numbers.
It's certainly an escalation of the behavior that this guy is not just following women just to follow them.
By 1998, McCarthy's fantasies were about to become the blueprint for rape and torture as he crossed the line from fantasy to violent reality. In 1997, Thomas McCarthy saw his first rape victim by chance as she was coming out of a hair salon. He spent the next year stalking her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The moment came on May 4th, 1998, when he stopped by her house on his way home from cleaning an aquarium.
When I opened the screen door, I think she heard that because she came out of the bathroom, and as I heard her walking towards me, so I just charged up the stairs, ran at her, grabbed her.
He gagged and bound his victim, and for hours he sexually assaulted her repeatedly.
I took her downstairs and I cut the clothesline that she had above, and I tied her hands behind her back, took her clothes off except for her blouse. I couldn't get her blouse off because her hands were tied, so I cut it off with the razor knife. And I forced her to give me oral sex, and I kind of poked her with the razor knife.
He tied her to a pole in her basement and tortured her with an 80,000-volt stun gun.
Took out the stun gun and shocked her with that. Sparked it a few times to scare her with it. I think I did it like on her hip. I don't remember exactly. It might have been on her side. But she was face down on the bed, and I shocked her with it for 4 or 5 seconds.
There were great similarities between this fantasy narrative that he had compiled, I think, back in 1992, and our attack on our victim. You know, we went through and we could highlight, you know, certain items that he used during the course of the attack, and the same items he made reference to in this fantasy narrative, even up to, you know, the attacking the person, taking the person down into the basement, and, you know, attacking him at that location. There was a lot of similarities.
Incredibly, at one point during the attack, McCarthy left the victim tied to the pole in her basement and went outside to move his minivan into her driveway to avoid getting a parking ticket. Afterwards, he asked the victim who he should call to come and free her from the pole he tied her to. She gave him her mother's phone number, but he never called.
And what I planned to do was drive to a payphone somewhere and call her mother and tell her so she wouldn't be there all night. And this was about 2:30. When I got in the car to leave, I realized I had just received a page from my wife wanting to know where the hell I was.
For a month after the rape, McCarthy repeatedly drove past the homes of both the victim and her parents. And that's not all he did to terrorize her.
Did you ever call on the telephone?
Yeah.
Why did you call him?
I don't really know, just to hear her voice. Maybe to taunt her.
She already been brutalized. She knows the person's out there, and now she's getting phone calls, strange vehicles driving by her house, stopping and looking. So it was just a continued terror for that victim.
But she wasn't the only woman that McCarthy tortured. In his confession to police, McCarthy revealed for the first time that there is a second victim.
Really didn't take any prodding. He wanted to talk, and, that was the agreement that we had reached, that he had to be truthful with us. And we found out that the second rape victim was a lady from Cleveland, Ohio, which he gave to us that nobody else had any knowledge of.
On May 20th, 1999, McCarthy had another firefighter cover his shift so he could attend an aquarium club meeting. After the meeting, he drove past the house of another woman he had been watching.
Got my mask, and I got my infected clothes, and I had a knife with me that night. So I walked up right behind her, and she didn't even hear me. So she turned around and smiled, and I grabbed her around the mouth with my left hand. I held her real tight, and I had the knife in my right hand, and I held it at her throat.
McCarthy repeatedly sexually assaulted and tortured the woman for an hour and a half.
And I made her lie down on the floor, and I tied her hands behind her back. I had some rope with me that time. 12 sections of rope, and I tied her hands behind her back. And I took her downstairs and raped her, and I didn't have the stun gun, so what I did, she had a window fan. I cut the cord off, shocked her with that.
If you use more force than you need to, then that gets into the sadistic area, that someone is getting pleasure in causing pain rather than just getting the victim to do their bidding.
According to his statement, for the next 3 months, McCarthy limited himself to stalking. Then he saw Peggy Kilroy and followed her home. On Labor Day weekend, 1999, he returned to the Kilroy apartment with the intent to rape her. Looking through a screen door, he saw a figure sleeping on the couch. The door was locked, so he cut the screen and entered. Then he realized his mistake.
The more I looked at the person on the couch, I realized it was a man. Shit, I should just leave. I should have just left.
But he didn't.
I thought, well, maybe I could just threaten him, scare him into tie him up, and then tie him up real good, and then wait till Peggy gets him. Walked up to the couch, and I jumped on top of him, and I held the knife to him, and I told him to put his hands behind his back, and he started to, and he started struggling, and we started wrestling. He yelled, and someone came down from upstairs.
It was then that Brian Kilroy and the landlady overpowered McCarthy.
They whacked me with something, I think a base or something, a couple times on the head. I got some stitches. I kind of a little groggy after that, after struggling with the guy. By then the cops got there.
After Peggy Kilroy learned that she was the intended target of the attack, she listened to McCarthy's confession.
I needed some closure because your first reaction is, what was going to happen to me? And I had no clue. But at the same time, I did not like the fact that I learned what he had done to the girls.
But what she found even more frightening was McCarthy's conversational tone when he described how he tortured and raped his victims.
It was like explaining a ball game. He was just going through it, and he was just throwing out information. Well, this is what I did, and it was crazy. I thought, oh my gosh, how could a human being be like that?
When we return, McCarthy faces his victims in court.
What I was seeing when I eye to eye with him in the courtroom was there was no soul there, and that frightened me.
On July 13, 2000, Thomas McCarthy enters a Cleveland courtroom to plead guilty to 37 charges, including 12 counts of rape, 9 counts of assault, 2 counts of kidnapping, and 3 counts of stalking. Present in the courtroom are McCarthy's parents and friends. Also present are his victims. Before he is sentenced, McCarthy addresses the court.
There is something wrong with a man who would do the things that I did. Is it chemical, genetic, screws loose? I don't know, but something is wrong.
It was like watching a shell walking and talking. If they'd have opened his shirt and pulled the flap down and little mechanical things would have been going on like a robot, it would not have surprised me, because that's how hollow he seemed to me.
He's a predator, but that's who I saw. Everybody saw somebody different. My son saw somebody in the living room that was all in black. Peggy saw the person that followed her in the grocery store and frightened her. His mother and father saw another person. His wife definitely saw someone. And his children had to see someone who loved them very dearly.
McCarthy is confronted by his first rape victim.
He's white trash. He is evil. You, Mr. McCarthy, are a disgrace to the Cleveland Fire Department. Your parents, your family, your friends, your children. You have not only scarred me physically, but emotionally.
Then Peggy Kilroy speaks on behalf of her family.
I'm not happy that the city that fed your children and protected you is being hurt by your behavior.
I guess I'm not sure that he really comprehends what he did and how horrible it was.
McCarthy is sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole.
But I think there is some genuine remorse. You know, he told me that what he had done was horrible and he deserved to be punished. And the only good thing about the whole thing was that he was off the streets and he wouldn't be able to hurt anybody else.
Words like sorry and remorse seem so inadequate in this case. What I did was wrong. It was despicable. It was terrible and terrifying. It was sick.
I think he's sorry that he can't get those joys that he was getting from entering women's home. I think he's sorry that he's not able to sadistically torture females, but I don't think he's sorry for the victims. He's sorry for himself.
He's a piece of trash. I think that there's no room in this world for people like him. I thought it was wonderful that my brother ever empowered somebody and put a stop to such an awful creature, you know. At the same time, I still needed to be able to allow myself to go through the feeling of this hurt me, and I am affected by this. And there were some pretty heavy emotions to deal with all at once.
Emotions she couldn't deal with living in the house. After the attack, Peggy Kilroy had trouble even visiting the home she once shared with her mother.
She walked into the house probably 3 times in a year and a half. She had migraine headaches on every holiday. She didn't realize it. She would call and say, Mom, she's ready to walk out the door, and she said, I'm so sick, I feel so lousy. I said, Peggy, stay home.
McCarthy's legacy of fear and violence forced her mother to move also.
Didn't want to leave my friend. Caroline is my dearest friend, and she lives upstairs. And finally, we found a home that felt very secure and safe.
The first rape victim sued McCarthy for assault and battery, false imprisonment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress committed upon her during the course of the sexual assault. She won more than $3 million, money she will most likely never collect. Still, questions remain about the case.
What I'm still amazed at is how anybody can operate in a big city like this with that kind of a volume and not be noticed. It just amazes me how that could happen.
Did the investigators find all of McCarthy's victims? The answer when we return. McCarthy is serving his 30-year sentence at the Mansfield Correctional Institution. He is participating in a treatment program for sex offenders. He is scheduled to be released in 2030 when he will be 73 years old. After the trial, McCarthy and his wife divorced. Mary McCarthy and their children have since left the state of Ohio. However, his children still visit him.
I realize now that the nice guys that, you think you don't necessarily know them.
Tom Bradshaw still struggles to understand how his friend could have committed such heinous crimes and wonders if there was anything he could have done to stop him.
There was a lot of guilt because I felt that how could I have not known that this was going on? How could I have not suspected something and done something about it? But and I talked to him later, and he said there was no way you could have known. There was nothing to see. I kept it secret.
I have since had conversations with people who knew him, grew up with him, hung out with him, and he had everybody completely buffaloed about his activities.
This is a secret part of their life that they learn to keep very compartmentalized and removed from the rest of their life.
There are other unanswered questions, like the 10-year gap between McCarthy's first attempted rape and the attack in Middleburg Heights. What happened during the years in between?
I have a big problem with believing that from 1987 to 1997 he was a good boy. I don't believe that. But I can't prove it, and I don't have a victim to show it.
Considering the time frame that was involved and all the data that he had collected and all the women that he had followed, it's difficult to believe that it was only the 2 identified victims.
Based on my experience with sex offenders, once a sex offender, always a sex offender.
You know, his sentence is that he's going to be in prison till he's an elderly man, and a victim may feel, well, you know, rather than having to relive the horror of the attack, it's not going to add anything significant to his punishment.
I still think there's other people, and he's not really telling us everything. He's just telling us enough to get us off his back.
The Middleburg Heights police believe that the amount of time McCarthy spent in the victim's house indicates that he probably committed this type of crime before.
If it had been his first time, he may have been a little scared after the first half hour and wanted to get out of there. But he continued on and spent a couple hours in the house, not even thinking or caring if anybody was going to come in and catch him.
I believe that had he not been apprehended by Mr. Kilroy, the victim's brother, that he would have killed somebody in a sadistic nature soon, because he appeared to be escalating the violence and escalating the chances he was taking to apprehend or to torture these women.
It was the action of Brian Kilroy that stopped a sexual predator.
Had he not by chance be sleeping on that couch the night that McCarthy entered his sister's home, there could have been other homicides, certainly other rapes would have occurred. Certainly Brian Kilroy has saved this community more pain than we could ever have endured.
I just had that opportunity. Most anybody else put in that exact same situation probably would reacted exactly the same.
And how long would it have continued? My opinion? I've been a police officer for 28 years. I can tell you that he wasn't going to quit until he was caught.